think we provided sufficient evidence that the Founding Fathers believed in this idea that within one nation there were two kingdoms, the church and the state, and they were supposed to function separately one from another, each within its own sphere, each with its own sword. But we were noticing in our last session that the Founding Fathers did not always abide by the principles that they taught. In other words, they expressed their opinions, but their actions did not always reflect what they taught. And we were dealing specifically with James Madison and the comment that David Barton had made that the Founding Fathers were inconsistent sometimes in their application of these two principles upon which the United States was built. And we read a statement from Timothy Hall, where he expressed this contradictory character of the Founding Fathers sometimes in what they taught versus what they practiced. And we were dealing with a bill that was introduced by James Madison titled "A Bill for Punishing Disturbers of Religious Worship and Sabbath Breakers." Interestingly enough, on that same day, Thomas Jefferson introduced a bill, and I'm going to read the bill now. It's in your syllabus in the middle of the page. "No man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or beliefs, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinion in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities." Now, that's what Jefferson introduced this very same day that this bill was introduced to punish people who broke the Sabbath Sunday as it was understood back then. Is this obviously a contradiction? A contradiction in the same day, because Madison's bill stated, "If any person on Sunday shall himself be found laboring at his own or any other trade or calling, or shall employ his apprentices, servants, or slaves in labor, or other business, except it be in the ordinary household, he shall forfeit the sum of 10 shillings for every such offense." In other words, he's going to be fined, because he's doing work on what they believe to be the Sabbath, which was really Sunday. Now, it's important to realize that both of these bills were introduced in 1786, which is actually 5 years before the Bill of Rights is approved. And so we need to understand that this is the maybe early Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Incidentally, do you know that this bill that was introduced by James Madison was actually written by Thomas Jefferson? That's what makes it even more interesting. The basic point, folks, is that the Founding Fathers were not always consistent with the principles that they taught in actual practice. For example, they taught that all men are created equal and have been endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, except for the African Americans. How did they treat the African Americans? As slaves, right? They brought from Africa. Were they guaranteed liberty and the pursuit of happiness in life? Of course not. So was that unconstitutional? Of course it was unconstitutional. The point is that just because they did not abide by their principles does not mean that that this nation was not founded upon those principles. Are you understanding what I'm saying or not? The fact is that we have plenty of evidence that this nation was established upon this idea of separation of church and state. Now let's go to the title, John Adams and the Treaty of Tripoli. On June 10, 1797, which is 1 year before the deadly wound is administered to the papacy, John Adams signed into law, he was the president, the Treaty of Tripoli. And a part of the Treaty of Tripoli read like this: "The government of the United States is not in any sense founded upon the Christian religion." I'll tell you, Christian conservatives in the United States have had almost a heart attack over this statement in the Treaty of Tripoli. Because they say, what do you mean? This is a Christian nation. This was established a Christian nation. Folks, if this was established a Christian nation, that would be unconstitutional. Because it's establishing the Christian religion. Are you with me? Now let's pursue this. Notably, President Adams sent this treaty to the Senate in May of 1797, and it was read aloud before the Senate. Written copies were given to all of the senators. The vote in favor of this treaty was unanimous. It was published in the newspapers in Philadelphia and New York. There was not a whimper of protest because it said the government of the United States is not in any sense founded upon the Christian religion. If the founders had founded the U.S. upon the Christian religion, they would have been going against their own principles, which the First Amendment says that the civil government cannot establish religion. Are you understanding what I'm saying? So it would have been unconstitutional, in other words, for them to do this. So was the United States founded upon the Christian religion? No, it was actually a nation that was founded by Christians. The United States is not a Christian nation, it's a nation composed in its majority by Christians. Now, you can read this rather long statement. I'm not going to dedicate the time to this long statement by John Adams. I hope that you'll read it. It's a powerful statement about the separation of church and state and how important it is for the state not to apply penal laws to religious matters. So I hope that you'll read this statement in your syllabus. Let's go to the section that speaks about the First Amendment. The First Amendment. You know, it's become fashionable among Christian activists to say that the separation of church and state is not in the Constitution because the Constitution does not say separation of church and state. But the fact is, folks, that the concept of the separation of church and state is found in the Constitution of the United States, even though the exact expression is not found. As we noticed, Thomas Jefferson spoke about the wall of separation between church and state, and he was one of the framers of the Constitution of the United States. Now, the First Amendment, let's take a look at how it reads. This is found in the middle of the page where you have the subtitle, The First Amendment. Congress shall make no law. Now, what part of no law don't you understand? It's absolutely clear, isn't it? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Notice it doesn't say that Congress can't make a law that establishes a church above other churches, or a religion or one religion above another religion. The word religion has no definite or indefinite article. Congress can make no law establishing any religious observance, in other words. So the first clause says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, and now comes the second clause of the First Amendment, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So Congress can't make a religious law, and it can't make a law that forbids people to practice their religion. And then the third clause of the First Amendment contains civil rights. So does the First Amendment contain the idea of separation of church and state? Absolutely, even though the phrase is not used. The third clause says that Congress can't make any law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Are those all civil rights? Yeah. So the two horns like a lamb are contained in the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, in other words. Now, I mentioned this before. Some Christian activists say, well, you know, the First Amendment applies to the federal government, but it doesn't apply to the states. The 14th Amendment blows that out of the water. The 14th Amendment says that it applies to the states as well. Now, the final paragraph says, clearly the First Amendment forbids Congress from drawing up laws that have anything to do with religion, period. In this sense, the Constitution clearly contains the concept of separation of church and state, because the state is forbidden to make laws that establish religion or prohibit the free exercise of religion. Thus, the state can have absolutely nothing to do with religion, except to protect everyone's right to practice it freely according to the dictates of their own conscience. Of course, people are not permitted to disobey legitimate civil laws in the name of religion, such as flying airplanes into the World Trade Center. Someone has expressed it this way: your freedom ends where my nose begins. I think that's a good way of expressing it. So what was the vision of the Founding Fathers? The Founding Fathers envisioned not a Christian nation, but rather a nation of Christians. Their ideal was that the church should do the work of implanting Christ's kingdom in the human heart by teaching honesty, chastity, respect for life and property, family values, etc. In this way, the church would leaven society from within, and society would be moral and righteous. Not by legislation. Does the church have a role to play when it comes to the morality of society? Yes. The church is indispensable. It's vital. The idea was not that the government should impose by legislation the moral values of the church to make society moral. This is not the mission of the church. The mission of the church is to leaven society by preaching the Word of God, so that society can be transformed from inside out, not from outside in. This is what is taught in the parable of the leaven. Now, in the remaining time that we have in this session, I want to read a series of statements by other thinkers concerning separation of church and state. And I will begin with Thomas Paine. In many ways, he was a pain. Ellen White describes him as an enemy of the Bible and an enemy of religion, and he's one of the few people that Ellen White says will be outside the holy city after the 1,000 years. But he said some very interesting things about this idea of separation of religion from the civil power. In 1791 to 1792, you have a book that he wrote, The Rights of Man, where he stated, persecution is not an original feature in any religion, but it is always the strong marked feature of all law religions. In other words, religions that are based on civil law, or religions established by law. Take away the law establishment, and every religion reassumes its original benignity. Are you understanding what he's saying? Here's another statement. Toleration is not the opposite of intolerance, but the counterfeit of it. We say the opposite of intolerance is tolerance. No, he says that's a false idea. He continues saying, both are despotisms. The one assumes to itself the right of withholding liberty of conscience, the other of granting it. Are you catching the point? Now let's notice what Isaac Backus had to say. This is 1773. This is really early. Religious matters are to be separated from the jurisdiction of the state, not because they are beneath the interests of the state, but quite to the contrary, because they are too high and holy, and thus are beyond the competence of the state. I love that statement. Notice what Patrick Henry had to say. This in 1770, he lived between 1736 and 1799. That religion, or the duty we owe to our Creator, and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. and therefore all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion according to the dictates of conscience. Was this a prevalent idea back then? I mean, can you see the two horns like a lamb in the writings of all of these individuals? It's very clear. Samuel West preached a sermon in 1776. Is that an important date? Notice what he preached. For the civil authority to pretend to establish particular modes of faith and forms of worship, and to punish all that deviate from the standards which our superiors have set up, is attended with the most pernicious consequences to society. It cramps all free and rational inquiry, fills the world with hypocrites and superstitious bigots, nay, with infidels and skeptics. It exposes men of religion and conscience to the rage and malice of fiery, blind zealots, and dissolves every tender tie of human nature. Those are strong words. And I cannot but look upon it as a peculiar blessing of heaven that we live in a land where everyone can freely deliver his sentiments upon religious subjects and have the privilege of worshiping God according to the dictates of his own conscience, without any molestation or disturbance, a privilege which I hope we shall ever keep up and strenuously maintain. John Leland, 1791. I'm reading this because I want you to see that this idea was broad. The two horns like a lamb were contained in many, many writings of the founding fathers and those who lived at that time. Here is what John Leland had to say. Is conformity of sentiments in matters of religion essential to the happiness of civil government? In other words, is everybody getting together and believing the same thing a good thing for government, is what he's asking. Not at all. Government has no more to do with the religious opinions of men than it has with the principles of the mathematics. Let every man speak freely without fear, maintain the principles that he believes, worship according to his own faith, either one God, three gods, no God, or 20 gods, and let government protect him in doing so. That is to say, see that he meets with no personal abuse or loss of property for his religious opinions. Instead of discouraging him with proscriptions, fines, confiscation, or death, let him be encouraged as a free man to bring forth his arguments and maintain his points with all boldness. Then, if his doctrine is false, it will be confuted. And if it is true, though ever so novel, let others credit it. When every man has this liberty, what can we wish for? For more? A liberal man asking for nothing more of government. So clear. He also stated on the next page, the liberty I contend for is more than toleration. See, the founding fathers were against toleration. You know, I'll tolerate your religion. No. When you tolerate the religion, you're granting something. They have a right of religion without you granting anything. It's an inalienable right, in other words. So he says, the liberty I contend for is more than toleration. The very idea of toleration is despicable. It supposes that some have a preeminence above the rest to grant indulgence, whereas all should be equally free, Jews, Turks, pagans, and Christians. Test oaths and established creeds should be avoided as the worst evils. Now there's a series of other thinkers here as well. Henry Clay, 1818. All religions united with government are more or less inimical to liberty. All separated from governments are compatible with liberty. What did Abraham Lincoln have to say? When the know-nothings get control, that is the Declaration of Independence, will read, all men are created equal except Negroes, foreigners, and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer immigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty, to Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. Quite a statement. Millard Fillmore, 1856. By the way, if you're wondering who these are, there's a little explanation of who these individuals are at the bottom of each statement. 1856, he said, "I am tolerant of all creeds. Yet, if any sect suffered itself to be used for political objects, I would meet it by political opposition." Would that be right to do? That would be upholding the First Amendment, right? In my view, church and state should be separate, not only in form, but in fact. Religion and politics should not be mingled. Ever heard of Ulysses S. Grant? 1875. Encourage free schools and resolve that not $1 of money shall be appropriated to the support of any sectarian school. Wow, no vouchers is what he's saying. Because some Christians say, well, you know, you're restricting religious liberty when you say that the government should not give money for parents to send their schools, their kids to religious schools. What happens when the state gives money for parents to send their kids to religious schools? That is supporting what? It's supporting religion. Oh, so you're saying you're anti-religious. What about religious displays on public property? You know, what about in God we trust? One nation under God. You know, people say you got to have that in there. If not, you're an atheist. You're anti-Christian. No. See, government is to be secular. And the church is to be religious. Those are the principles. So he continues saying, resolve that neither the state nor nation, or both combined, shall support institutions of learning other than those sufficient to afford every child growing up in the land the opportunity of a good common school education unmixed with sectarian, pagan, or atheistical tenets. Leave the matter of religion to the family altar, the church and the private schools supported entirely by private contributions. Keep the church and the state forever separated. Jeremiah Black, 1885. The manifest object of the men who framed the institution of this country was to have a state without religion and a church without politics. That is to say, they meant that one should never be used as an engine for the purposes of the other. For that, they built a wall of complete partition between the two. See, all these thinkers, they know what the founding fathers were talking about. Theodore Roosevelt, ever heard of him? The great environmentalist. Many of our national parks are due to the work of Theodore Roosevelt. He said, if there is one thing for which we stand in this country, it is for complete religious freedom. And it is an emphatic negation of this right to cross-examine a man on his religion before being willing to support him for public office. In other words, asking about his religion before he can run for public office. Alfred E. Smith, 1927. We're going in chronological order. He was governor of New York and Democratic candidate for president in 1928. I believe in absolute freedom of conscience for all men and equality of all churches, all sects, and all beliefs before the law as a matter of right and not as a matter of favor. See, it's an inalienable right, is what he's saying. It's not granted. Listen, religious freedom is not granted by the government. It belongs to the church. You know, the government doesn't grant you the right to happiness. It's a divine right that you have, apart from government. All the government can do is protect that right. So he says, I believe in absolute freedom of conscience for all men and equality of all churches, all sects, and all beliefs before the law as a matter of right and not as a matter of favor. I believe in the absolute separation of church and state and in the strict enforcement of the Constitution that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. I believe that no tribunal of any church has any power to make any decree or enforce any any force in the land, or enforce any law in the land other than to establish the status of its own communicants within its own church. John F. Kennedy, who was a Roman Catholic, 1959. Interesting what he said. It is my firm belief that there should be separation of church and state in the United States. By the way, Rick Santorum said that that was one of the worst things that Kennedy ever said as President of the United States. His speech that he gave, that we're going to read in a few moments, the speech that he gave to the ministers in Houston, to the Ministerial Association. So he says, it is my firm belief that there should be separation of church and state in the United States. That is, that both church and state should be free to operate. Is that the two horns? Yeah. Without interference from each other in their respective areas of jurisdiction. We live in a liberal democratic society which embraces wide varieties of belief and disbelief. There is no doubt in my mind that the pluralism which has developed under our Constitution, providing as it does a framework within which diverse opinions can exist side by side and by their interaction enrich the whole, is the most ideal system yet devised by man. I cannot conceive of a set of circumstances which would lead me to a different conclusion. Did John F. Kennedy believe in the separation of church and state? I think that perhaps he might have gotten killed for it. But anyway, that's a conspiracy theory, which I said I don't believe in. Lyndon Johnson, 1964. This is after the death of John F. Kennedy. He's President of the United States. He says, I believe in the American tradition of separation of church and state, which is expressed in the First Amendment to the Constitution. By my office and by my personal conviction, I am sworn to uphold that tradition. Carl N. Degler, 1970, had this to say, in the 18th century, the American principle of separation of church and state was indeed an audacious experiment. It had never been tried before. Never before had a national state been prepared to dispense with an official religion as a prop to its authority, and never before had a church been set adrift without the support of the state. Throughout most of American history, the doctrine has provided freedom for religious development while keeping politics free of religion. And that, apparently, had been the intention of the Founding Fathers. Gerald R. Ford. Remember him? He took the presidency when Richard Nixon was impeached. He stated, I believe that prayer in public schools should be voluntary. Incidentally, does the First Amendment allow students to get together for prayer in public school? Yes, it does. What it does not allow is for the school, which is funded by money from the federal government, to write a prayer and mandate that prayer for all students in the school. But you know, Christian activists, they say, well, you know, prayer was kicked out of public school. It wasn't kicked out. It's government-established prayers that have been kicked out of public schools. And when the government sponsors a prayer in public school, is prayer something we owe to the federal government? It's something we owe to God. So you're saying, Pastor, you're a secular humanist. No, I'm not a secular humanist. I just believe that prayer belongs to God. And you know, if you're going to pray, pray in the home. If the students want to gather and form a prayer group in school, more power to them. They can even form a Bible study group in school if it's their initiative. You know, some school officials have forbidden kids from doing that. They've been taken to court, and the school is lost because it's their religious right, as long as it's led by the students. So Ford says, I believe that prayer in public schools should be voluntary. It is difficult for me to see how religious exercises can be a requirement in public schools, given our constitutional requirement of separation of church and state. I feel that the highly desirable goal of religious education must be principally the responsibility of church and home. I do not believe that public education should show any hostility toward religion, and neither should it inhibit voluntary participation if it does not interfere with the educational process. He had it absolutely straight and correct. Sam J. Ervin. Anybody heard of him? Good old Sam. He was one of my favorite congressmen, senators to watch on television. This was when I was a teenager. This was a long time ago. But he was known as Honest Sam Ervin. He stated this: many sincere persons, 1983, many sincere persons charge that the school prayer cases show the Supreme Court to be hostile to religion, because the Supreme Court said no prayer in public schools, mandated and written by the government. So Christians said, oh, the Supreme Court kicked religion out of school. That's the argument. What did Sam Ervin have to say? This charge is what? Untrue and unjust. In these cases, the Supreme Court was faithful to its judicial duty. It enforced the First Amendment, which commands government to maintain strict neutrality respecting religion, neither aiding nor opposing it, but giving everybody the right, or protecting every right of every sect to practice their religion. He also stated this: government is contemptuous of true religion when it confiscates the taxes of Caesar to finance the things of God. And incidentally, George Bush signed an executive order taking federal money to get to charitable organizations. And these charitable organizations, there's no way of really checking to see whether they're really proselytizing for their religion. So this is an infringement of the separation between church and state, as far as I'm concerned. Here we find another statement by Sam Ervin. If religious freedom is to endure in America, the responsibility for teaching religion to public school children must be left to the homes and churches of our land, where this responsibility rightly belongs. Was he right? Absolutely. It must not be assumed by the government through the agency of the public school system. So Sam Ervin was in favor of kicking religion out of public school. That's the way the Christian right sees it in the United States. But no, we send our kids to public school to gain an education. Religion is something that should take place in the home, and it should take place in the church. Notice Leonard Levy. This is 1986. The wall of separation ensures the government's freedom from religion and the individual's freedom of religion. The second probably cannot flourish without the first. See the two horns there again? Time and again in these writings. John M. Swamley, 1987, had this to say: voluntary individual silent prayer has never been banned or discouraged in public schools. The Supreme Court has banned state-sponsored religious services. Those who advocate prayer services in the public schools do not want voluntary prayer. Is that true? You better believe it. They want the government to be officially involved in promoting and sponsoring prayer services so as to put pressure on children to engage in public prayer. They apparently do not care whether parents want their children to engage in public prayer or be indoctrinated with sectarian religious ideas. The object is to provide a captive classroom audience that will be exposed to the prayers of those with a religious message which they deliver in the form of a prayer. Leo Pfeffer, 1990, wrote this: recognizing the evils of man acting like God, or of man's using government to help God out in the managing the world, the traditional religionists, such as disciples of Roger Williams, Isaac Backus, and John Leland, joined with the deists in fashioning a system in which neither belief nor disbelief in God was to be a matter within the jurisdiction of human government. Both groups sought to secure a government that neither aided nor injured religion. And for this, both the establishment and free exercise clauses of the First Amendment were adopted. Now, John F. Kennedy, this is an interesting case. I remember when I lived in Caracas, Venezuela, because I grew up there in Venezuela from the time I was 5 till the time I was 14. I remember when John F. Kennedy was running for president of the United States, there was a great commotion in Adventist churches in Venezuela. They said, the Sunday law is right around the corner. For the first time, the United States is going to have a Roman Catholic president. And in the United States, there was also a lot of unrest about having a Roman Catholic president. In other words, there was great suspicion about the Roman Catholic Church having a president in the United States. So, John F. Kennedy had to go to the Houston Ministerial Association to express his views on church and state. And that happened on September 12, 1960, when he was running for president. Now, I want you to notice what he said. This is strange for a Roman Catholic to say this. And I believe that, you know, with Rick Santorum, for example, who is a radical Catholic, this went over like a lead balloon. He was extremely critical of John F. Kennedy for these words that he spoke. I'm going to read it now. I believe in an America where separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference, and where no man is denied public office merely because his religion differs from the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him. I believe in an American that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish, where no public official either requests or accepts instruction on public policy from the Pope, the National Council of Churches, or any other ecclesiastical source, where no religious body seeks to impose its will directly or indirectly upon the general populace or the public acts of its officials, and where religious liberty is so indivisible that an act against one church is treated as an act against all. Did he have it straight? How is it that all of these thinkers had it straight, but a few radicals, Christian radicals today say, you know, that God has been kicked out of government? No, God hasn't been kicked out of government. The role of government is not to convert people to God. The role of government is to preserve the civil order. Now, Alexis de Tocqueville, you know who he was? He did a tour of the United States. He was a political thinker, French, and a historian. He toured the United States from 1831 to 1833. And he wrote a 2-volume set called Democracy in America. If you can get copies of these, it's a fascinating read, these 2 volumes. And I want you to notice the conclusion that he reached as to the reason why the United States was such a prosperous nation and such a peaceful nation. Because he interviewed many people in the United States to ask them what their opinion was. And this is how he expressed it. All attributed the peaceful dominion of religion in their country mainly to the separation of church and state. I do not hesitate to confirm that during my stay in America, I did not meet a single individual of the clergy or the laity who was not of the same opinion. Interesting. But Ellen White has given a dire warning. And I want to read this warning. Protestants have tampered with and patronized popery. That means the papacy. They have made compromises and concessions. Now listen to this. Which papists themselves are surprised to see and fail to understand. In other words, the papacy says, this is too good to be true. Another way of expressing it. What would she write today? This was back in the 1880s, where you had the national reform movement and the agitation for a national Sunday law. So, you know, in that context, the Protestants were saying, let's have the Catholics join us for a national Sunday law. It doesn't matter if they're Catholics. Well, Ellen White is writing in this context. She says, Protestants have made compromises and concessions which papists themselves are surprised to see and fail to understand. Men are closing their eyes to the real character of Romanism and the dangers to be apprehended from her supremacy. And now notice what she says, because there are those in our midst who say, it's not time to talk about these things yet. You know, it's not time to say anything about the papacy or apostate Protestantism. The time will come when we will do that, but not now. Notice what Ellen White had to say. The people need to be aroused to resist the advances of this most dangerous foe to civil and religious liberty. We must cry out, because there are people in this system that love the Lord that don't know anything about what we're talking about. You know, most young people these days, all they know is the text that they receive on their cell phone. That's about it. You know, people don't even communicate anymore. You know, sitting in the subway in New York, you know, everybody. It's ridiculous. Can we dedicate too much time even to good things? Of course we can. Absolutely. It's a waste of time. Let's answer our emails and get on with life. Notice this statement, friend. This is my favorite statement of Ellen White about what's going to happen with the United States. Was this nation established by divine providence? Yes. You know, that is one point where the book that I sent you ahead of time, I kind of disagree a little bit with what he says, because he gives the impression that the United States, although he does say in a couple places in the book that the United States is unique, I don't think he makes it strong enough that the United States was raised by the providence of God. Notice this statement. When the land which the Lord provided as an asylum for his people, that they might worship him according to the dictates of their own consciences, the land over which for long years the shield of omnipotence has been spread, the land which God has favored by making it the depository of the pure religion of Christ. When that land shall, through its legislators, that's Congress, isn't it? Through its legislators, abjure, that is abandon, forsake the principles of Protestantism, and give countenance to Romish apostasy in tampering with God's law, it is then that the final work of the man of sin will be revealed. And now comes the amazing statement. Protestants will throw their whole influence and strength on the side of the papacy. By a national act. What is a national act? It's an act of Congress. It's a law of Congress. By a national act enforcing the false Sabbath, they will give life and vigor, because the papacy has a deadly wound, right? They will give life and vigor to the corrupt faith of Rome, reviving, that means that she was dead, reviving her tyranny and oppression of conscience. Then it will be time for God to work in mighty power for the vindication of his truth. So, do you understand this prophecy of Revelation chapter 13, verses 11 to 18? You understand it better? Is it clear that this nation was established on the basis of two Christ-like principles? Church and state. Yes. Is it clear that this nation, slowly but surely, is starting to get ready, is warming up its vocal cords to speak like a dragon by repudiating the principles of its constitution? We see things that are happening that show that this is absolutely true. So let me ask you this. Is the Adventist view of these prophecies biblical? Amen. Solidly biblical. Absolutely, folks. Was Ellen White right in her assessment and explanation of these prophecies? Absolutely, unquestionably, because we've studied this from the perspective of Scripture, we've studied it from the perspective of Ellen White, and we've studied it from the perspective of the great thinkers, starting with the founding fathers, all throughout the course of the history of this nation. Now we're going to go to our next lesson, the image of and to the beast. We've talked about the beast. We've dealt with the second beast of Revelation chapter 13. Now we need to talk about what is the image of the beast. By the way, it's the image of which beast? It's the image of the first beast. And who makes the image of the first beast? The second beast. That's right. Now, let's go to the introductory remarks here in the lesson, the image of and to the beast. In a previous lecture, we identified the sea beast of Revelation 13, verse 1 through 10 as the Roman Catholic papacy. We also studied the land beast of Revelation 13:11, and we noticed that it represents the United States. The two lamb-like horns represent the church and the state, separate from one another. What did the papacy do during the 1260 years? What characterizes especially the papacy? The union of church and state, because the Vatican is a church and it is a state. And in this way, it tries to influence the political leaders of the world through the state aspect of its existence. Now the question is, what is the image of the beast? In order to understand what the image of the beast is, the sea beast is, we must first ascertain what characterized the first beast. I mean, if it's an image of the beast, it must be like the first beast, right? You know, let me give you an example. When you get up in the morning and you look in the mirror, what do you see? A disaster. At least that's what I see, a total disaster. You know, something that really needs fixing. Does the mirror lie? I can argue with the mirror, but the mirror tells me the truth. It tells me just as I am. It is a reflection of me. So basically, the image of the beast is going to be a what? A replica or a reflection of the beast in honor of the beast. Now, I want you to notice here what Ellen White had to say about this. But what is the image of the beast? And how is it to be formed? The image is made by the two-horned beast and is an image to the beast. It is also called an image of the beast. Remember we studied that when we dealt with the exegetical remarks? Then, to learn what the image is like and how it is to be formed, we must study the characteristics of the beast itself. What? The papacy. So here's the question. What is the central characteristic of the papacy which would help us understand what the image of the papacy is? The union of church and state. Folks, that is the foundation of the papacy. Everything the papacy does is founded on that. Now let's notice on the next page this statement from Ellen White about how the papacy gained its power. The first thing that has to happen is that the true church has to lose its power, has to lose the Spirit. Can we say that of Protestantism today? Protestantism is so messed up today. There's no power. There's a counterfeit power, but there's no true power in Protestantism today. Why? Notice this statement, Great Controversy, page 443. When the early church became corrupted, how did it become corrupted? By departing from the simplicity of the gospel. See, you see the steps here? It basically, first of all, it departs from the simplicity of the gospel. And then what does it do? accepting heathen rites and customs, that's culture, by the way, infiltrating the church. She lost the spirit and power of God. And in order to control the consciences of the people, see, because the conscience of the people didn't provide control anymore, so society's spiraling out of control. So what's the solution? The solution, is to use force to make them to be moral. And so it continues saying, and in order to control the consciences of the people, and I added this because the Holy Spirit no longer did, she sought what? The support of the secular power. The result was the papacy. A church that controlled what? The power of the state. Do you notice how Ellen White defines the word papacy? The result was what? The papacy. A church that controlled the power of the state. So what is the papacy according to the Spirit of Prophecy? It's a church that controls the state. Then she continues saying, and employed it, that is the power of the state, to further her own ends, especially for the punishment of heresy, in order for the United States to form an image of the beast. The religious power, that is the church, must so control the civil government, which is the secular sword, that the authority of state will also be employed by the church to accomplish her own ends. Is that simple? So what is the image of the beast that is built by the beast that comes forth from the earth? The image is the union of what? Of church and state in the United States of America. Now, as we have seen, the papacy during the 1260 years united the church with the state and used the punitive sword of the state to punish those who dissented from her beliefs and practices. Apostate Protestantism in the United States, the land beast, will make a replica of this. Especially the spiritual leaders will work upon the secular power to safeguard their institutions and punish those who dissent. In this way, they will make an image of the mother from whom they were born. Like mother, like daughter, in other words. By making the image of the first beast, the United States will disown and contradict its own founding principles and make an image or replica of what the papacy did during the 1260 years. As a result, much of the history of the papacy will be repeated once again where? In the United States of America. In other words, the United States will speak like the dragon. And the dragon represents Satan working through whom? Satan working through Rome. Now I'm going to skip the title, the subtitle, The Identity of the Dragon. We've dealt with that. And also the title, the subtitle, The Roman Element, because we've already dealt with that. Let's go to The United States Speaks. We are told that the nation is going to speak like a dragon. Now, the question is, how does a nation speak? Particularly a nation that is a republican style of government. The answer is very simple. It speaks through the laws that are enacted by the congressional leaders that are elected by popular vote. In fact, Ellen White understood this when she wrote in Great Controversy 442, the speaking of the nation is the action of its legislative and judicial authorities. Notice she says legislative and judicial. We'll come to that a little bit later. By such action, it will give the lie. In other words, it will contradict those liberal and peaceful principles which it has put forth as the foundation of its policy. Is this becoming clearer and clearer, what all this is about in the book of Revelation? Now, it's interesting to notice, as I've mentioned before, that this is the only time in Scripture that the kind of horns are defined in the Bible. Other places it says that the beast has horns, but here it specifies what kind of horns. It says 2 horns like a lamb, which means that it must bear some relationship to Jesus Christ, the Lamb, the 2 kingdoms that Jesus recognized. Now you'll notice here that it doesn't say that this beast will have 2 horns like a lamb, and then the 2 horns will be broken, and once the horns are broken, then it's going to start speaking like a dragon. No. It still has what? It still has the 2 horns. But at the same time that it has the 2 horns, it speaks like what? It speaks like a dragon. Let's go to the subtitle. We're not going to deal with the rest of this in Unique Beast. I hope that you don't take this syllabus and put it in your bookcase. I hope that you will read the entire syllabus. There's a lot of material that we can't cover here because we don't have the time to deal with it. Did the United States rise providentially in the providence of God? It did. It rose by a special creative act. In fact, the expression that is used there for sprouting up out of the earth is very similar to Genesis 1:24, where it says that God created the herbs that sprouted from the earth. In other words, this is a special creative act by God. And I want to read this one statement before I break. The greatest and most favored nation upon the earth is the United States. A gracious providence has shielded this country and poured upon her the choicest of heaven's blessings. Here the persecuted and oppressed have found refuge. Here the Christian faith in its purity has been taught. This people have been the recipients of great light and unrivaled mercies. Do you know why God raised this country? God did not raise this country so that it would speak like a dragon. God lifted up this country that established these 2 principles that are based on the idea of 2 kingdoms in one nation, because he wanted to provide a nation that would take the present truth message to the whole world in a time of peace. But that time of peace is coming to an end and will come to an end. And what we have not done in times of relative peace, we will have to do under the most trying circumstances.
Visit secretsunsealed.org for annual class dates and topics. Anchor is a seminary-level course of study on the fundamentals of Seventh-day Adventist theology taught by Pastor Stephen Bohr and guest theologians. Seating is limited.